Hi folks, my name is Brett Winterford. I'm the Regional Chief Security Officer for Okta in the Asia Pacific, and I'd like to thank you very much for having me here at UpGuard Summit. Okta's mission is to help everyone safely use any technology, and UpGuard's mission is to protect the world's data. So while we're focused very much at Okta on access, you guys are very much focused on governance. So I thought today I'd be trying to talk about the confluence of our two worlds. Where do we need to apply more governance around access to cloud applications, specifically SaaS applications? Many of you are probably involved in evaluating the security of cloud services for your customers. I've included here on this slide a list of the common areas of inquiry that we get from prospective customers prior to signing on with our service, which is all hosted in the cloud. So customers are typically asking for evidence or proof of our 4 nines of availability. They're asking what teams can access their configuration data or their log data, and under what circumstances is that access allowed? How do we authenticate those users to ensure the right people are accessing those resources? How do we handle vulnerabilities in our service? So, we talk them through everything from our internal testing of our features to the third parties that test our services, to public and private bug bounties we have for all of our services, and the right of our customers to perform penetration testing of our services. So we talk them through all that. We talk through what gets logged. How does the customer access those logs? We talk through security incidents. How will Okta engage with me in the case of a security incident at Okta that impacts my tenant or my data? And these are all great questions. So that's what we tend to evaluate before we take on a new SaaS provider. Another question is, how do we evaluate it? The how is where you guys often come in. So most of our customers can waltz on into an authenticated space to access our compliance documentation. They can access things like pre-filled questionnaires to get answers to those common questions a lot of customers have. Our US federal customers rely on authorizations. Many of our Australian customers rely on published audits against frameworks like IRAP. And then customers can also get a proxy or a snapshot of our hygiene based on what can be assessed via automated scanning of our internet-facing services, again, where services like yourselves come in. Our largest customers are able to negotiate for a right to audit Okta directly, or in some cases, we provide pooled audits for groups of regulated customers. So that's the how we tend to evaluate. One of the best ways that I think you can assess the security outcomes you get from working with a SaaS provider is to also understand the integration points between the identity provider, so someone like Okta or Microsoft Entra ID, for example, or Jump Cloud, and the service providers, that is the downstream SaaS apps. These are functional requirements that are really, really important to the security outcome you get from using those services. In my previous roles, we used to write a lot of requirements for our business units to say, before you engage with a cloud service provider, they need to meet these functional requirements. So we'd always demand that the application supports single sign-on, for example. We demand that the application supports lifecycle management using the SCIM protocol, so that the application could be managed by a central identity platform. We'd also evaluate local authentication policies. That is, how a user might sign into a SaaS app directly and not through the identity provider. There's a basic set of requirements you would expect that SaaS application to have. Can they enforce password complexity requirements? Or can you create password complexity requirements, for example? Can you enroll those users that access the app directly in 2FA? Can you enforce IP restrictions so that folks can only access that app from your corporate network, for example? One thing we always stressed as a security team is please, programmatic access to logs. Don't give us logs in some format where we've got to file a ticket to get access or something of that nature. There should be APIs available where we can pull those logs into our security systems. Now, this has been fine up to now, but the argument I'd like to make to you today is that this list of requirements needs to be updated. It needs to change. The reason why it needs to change is a well-defended organization today is going to apply strong authentication policies for access to all their critical applications and data. So those authentication policies are going to require MFA, they're going to evaluate device context. So for example, the authentication policies will consider whether or not that device has been used by that user before, whether that device is managed, or whether that device is exhibiting a secure posture through some integration between the IDP and an EDR endpoint protection platform. They're going to take into consideration network context. So are you authenticating via a secure web gateway, for example, versus are you authenticating via the public internet or some anonymizing service, for example? So for a lot of attackers, when they're going after high value targets, stealing a user's password now is only going to get them halfway to their prize, because there's a lot of other things being evaluated in policy before you get access to that resource. So what the wily attackers are doing is they're pivoting to the theft of what we call proof of authentication. Rather than just stealing the credential, they're stealing the credential and they're stealing the session tokens that are stored in the user's browser after they successfully sign in to a SaaS application or an IDP for that matter. The other thing that opportunistic attackers are doing is focusing on non-federated paths of access. So I'll talk about these two in a little more detail. When we talk about the theft of session tokens, I'm talking about the theft and replay of session tokens primarily using info-stealer malware. So that is in organizations that allow unmanaged devices to access their workplace resources. If there's malware on that device, let's say the kid uses the device at night to download some cracked games or something, ends up with info-stealer malware on it, the malware is extracting those session tokens after the legitimate user signs in from the user's browser, selling it on the dark web so that other people, for the duration of that session, if the session's still valid, can use that session token to sign in to the same session as the legitimate user. Theft and replay of sessions via adversary in the middle phishing attacks. So these are transparent HTTP proxies that are often used in phishing kits nowadays. You've probably heard of EvilGenX. Is a very popular open source kit where if the legitimate user is encouraged to sign in via this kit, they actually do authenticate through the proxy to the legitimate application, where the legitimate application sends back the session token, the phishing kit extracts it, sends that off to a Telegram channel where the attackers are waiting to log in to that session on behalf of the legitimate user. We've also seen supply chain attacks. For example, the attack against ourselves, against Okta in October last year, against Microsoft the following month in November, both involved adversaries that had managed to access corporate environments where they found session tokens that had been recorded in a system and extracted those session tokens and replayed them in their browsers. So there are several methods in which attackers are stealing post-authentication secrets in order to access these privileged resources. As I said, the other trend we've seen is abusing privileged access through non-federated paths of access. So I talked earlier about local authentication. For any given SaaS application, you can typically authenticate via your identity provider, where you'll have all of these strong authentication policies applied. But for some privileged users, they will have an exception process where they can authenticate to the SaaS app directly to perform maintenance or some other task. And they will set up some conditions whereby the authentication policy is determined at the SaaS app, not at the identity provider. And this is a blind spot for a lot of security teams. Generally speaking, there are weaker authentication policies available when you're authenticating to a SaaS application directly. At best, you can do 2FA and allow less to IPs. But you probably saw a recent spouted incidents on impacting Snowflake customers, for example, where a lot of users for these organizations, these privileged users like database admins, etc., had created these non-federated local paths of access in which all they needed was a username and password. In many cases, they were using a command line app that couldn't easily invoke the browser for single sign-on and MFA. So they'd created this path of access that only required a password. And in the world of rife info-stealer infections, that's pretty much a recipe for a bad day. So these are two things that have changed about security that we really, really need to focus on. So we need to update our requirements. What are our new requirements got to be? Yes, we still need all of our applications to support single sign-on without exception. We also need to check whether the SCIM provisioning integration supports deep provisioning. That is, if a user is removed from your source of truth, let's say your HR system, the identity provider should be able to recognize that and remove that user's account from all downstream apps automatically. It shouldn't have to be a manual process. There are a lot of posture management solutions emerging in the identity market. We've just recently launched our own to account for the fact that you do find these ghost accounts, these inactive accounts in downstream apps that again can be abused by threat actors. In terms of session controls, today we primarily evaluate risk at the point of sign-in, the point of authentication. The assurance we get from that user declines over time, during the course of the session. The risk, as I just discussed, is shifting now from attacks at the point of authentication to post-authentication attacks. So we need tools that evaluate user session risk throughout the duration of a user session. You're forcing the user to step up or re-authenticate whenever their risk level is deemed to have exceeded a certain threshold. There is an open standard for this called Continuous Access Evaluation Protocol by the OpenID Foundation, which a lot of SaaS apps and identity providers are embracing, as it means to exchange risk signals between each other during the course of a user session. So let's say, for example, in Salesforce, there is a user that is suddenly dumping a bunch of reports and downloading them. Salesforce might detect that and send a risk signal back to the identity provider to say, this particular user session looks a little risky right now. And because, say, in Okta, we have a capability called Universal Logout, where we can then log that user out of all the other downstream SaaS applications that they're currently authenticated to in one click, or even without a click, even just have an automated set of rules. So we need to be focused on post-authentication, not just evaluating risk at the point of authentication. For local authentication policies, obviously, we need to be able to, in those SaaS applications, deny non-federated access by default for any user that is federated. So if they are supposed to be authenticating via the identity provider, don't allow them to authenticate directly. We need the ability to unset user passwords for users that are federated, so those, again, that local access isn't available. We need to be able to ensure that we have solutions available for those privileged users using client applications to still be able to authenticate in a secure way. For our PAM tools, our privileged access management tools, we need to be able to rotate the secret used to authenticate to a SaaS application directly after every time it's used. It's not enough to simply vault a password and check it in and check it out. Because if you check out a password and you supply it to your browser to log into a SaaS application, then that credential is still accessible to any malware on your device for a period of time. And in my opinion, if privileged access management tools are doing their job, they should be rotating that password after you've used it. That requires, again, the SaaS application to have API coverage available to allow the PAM solution to rotate that credential via some back channel means. In terms of extensibility, we have to move from the use of long-lived static API tokens that inherit the permissions of the account that was used to create them, because that leads to really brittle integrations. API tokens should be short-lived. They should be location constrained. In other words, a token should only be able to be used from a set of IPs that the identity provider expects it to be used from. The API token should also be sender or client constrained. That is, once a user authenticates and the authorization server gives it the green light, that token should only be used by the client that presented for authentication and not by any other client into the future. There is a new standard called demonstrating proof of possession that's an OAuth standard that can be used to achieve that. And SaaS apps need to provide, again, the required API coverage so that third-party posture management tools, such as those that we produce, such as tools that the likes of UpGuard produces, can actually assess the hygiene of accounts in those downstream applications. So what have we been doing about it at Okta? First of all, we've been trying to support all the open standards that support these requirements that I just mentioned. So supporting continuous access evaluation protocol, for example, we are both a receiver, an aggregator, and a publisher of CAPE events. In other words, when we see something suspicious from our level of visibility that we can publish risk signals into the SaaS ecosystem. We can also receive risk signals back from SaaS applications. We can also aggregate them up so that a total risk score equals a certain automated action at the IDP. Demonstrating proof of possession, which is about sender constraining or client constraining the use of a token. We've built Depop support into our OAuth integrations. If you create a new OAuth integration in Okta, you can just enable Depop at the check of the box. We've also implemented Depop in a lot of our own solutions, our authenticators and all of our client software, so that when they're communicating back to central servers, the tokens are sender constrained using Depop. We've been sponsoring some IETF standards specifically around that ability to log a user out of all their downstream SaaS applications when user session risk is deemed to have exceeded a certain threshold. We call that universal logout at Okta. The global standard is called global token revocation. We've invested in posture management, just like UpGuard has, to identify where there are these gaps in MFA coverage and authentication policies in downstream SaaS applications. As I mentioned, we're publishing, subscribing, and aggregating risk signals, and we are advocating very strongly for FIDO2 authentication because while we support a mix of authenticators at the identity provider level, for that direct local authentication to a SaaS application without going through the IDP, you want to make sure that they support really strong factors, and FIDO2 is best in class for that. So the vision for us is to ensure that the next generation of business-to-business SaaS applications or enterprise SaaS applications don't repeat some of the mistakes of the past. We want to make sure that if you're building a new SaaS app using our customer identity cloud, which you might recall we acquired a company called Auth0, can make sure that these required features are a checkbox away. So while you're building the login, the authentication for a new SaaS application, that you just check the boxes for single sign-on, SCIM, Depop, CAPE, universal logout, FIDO2 support. It's all just there at a check of a box, so that the next generation of SaaS apps that you'll see in the future won't repeat some of these same basic issues that threat actors have been exploiting. That's it from me. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. I hope this has been educational for you. I hope that it's something that you guys will be looking at into the future in terms of evaluating the security outcomes you get out of a SaaS application. Thanks again.